awarded the Big Moose Prize for the novel from Black Lawrence Press. Her work has appeared in Puerto del Sol, Blackbird, and elsewhere, and has been nominated for the Pushcart Prize. After 30 years in San Francisco, she recently moved to Portland, Maine with her wife and dog. She's at work on a new novel. Thank you, Genanne, to you.
Thanks, Michael. Can you all hear me? Yes, it looks like you can. I'm really happy to be here with everyone. It makes me almost love Zoom again, to be here with you all. Thank you all for coming. And thank you, Peg, for being the reason that we're all here. So I'm going to read from Eggs in Purgatory. And it begins, it's a personal essay about my 89-year-old father's very self-directed end of life, among other things. And it begins with a suicide attempt, but I'm going to skip ahead to a scene a bit, to a point where he's in the hospital. My father pitched his case to Dr. A and to the psych team. Dad asserted that he wasn't depressed. I wondered. His world had shrunk in recent years. His hearing aid had broken and he hadn't told me, afraid of the expense and bother of a replacement, and his vision, exacerbated by glaucoma, was steadily worsening. He felt less confident walking around the neighborhood, and beyond our weekly shopping trip together and his visits to the doctor, he didn't get out much. He watched hours and hours of depressing news and bloviating pundits on MSNBC. To the medical team, he spoke about his right to choice, his lifelong interest in gerontology, and his spiritual convictions. He did not see death as a frightening end, merely a transmogrification of universal consciousness. He welcomed it. He wanted to be part of the big wow. My father cared deeply about vulnerable people, poor people, immigrants, the homeless, the forgotten and downtrodden. He had been a Catholic priest for 10 years and took the vows hoping to work as a missionary in China. And though he didn't get the overseas job he'd wanted, he met my mother when they worked together at a Catholic university in upstate New York. So the priesthood changed the trajectory of his life and hers and is entirely responsible for mine. Well, no longer Catholic, he was deeply spiritual, and the more progressive, the better. He adored A Course in Miracles, a kind of New Age Bible written or transcribed in the mid-1960s by a psychologist named Helen Schucman, who believed she was taking dictation directly from Jesus. I never read the book, but he quoted it often, entranced by the concept of a modern Christianity fueled by love rather than atonement, without the painful dogma of original sin. My father circled again and again to a concept that was revolutionary to a recovering Catholic. We are all connected to God, everyone and everything, no separation. A battered, well-thumbed copy of the book, stuffed with notes, sat by his chair, in a place where, in his early life, he might have kept a Bible. And though I can't always muster it, I want to believe, like him, in a larger, kinder, more connected intelligence. His adamant faith filtered down to me as wistfulness, leavened by skepticism, longing interspersed by flashes of spiritual insight and connection, a hunch rather than conviction. He cared about the vulnerable, but could not admit that he was vulnerable himself. He had no assets, no house, no car, no savings, and a tiny fixed income. In San Francisco, he qualified as extremely low income. He was eligible for Medi-Cal and other subsidies, less a safety net than a narrow, confusing set of hoops to jump through. He'd moved to California at my urging at age 80 after his previous arrangement, subletting a room from his older sister, ended when her health failed and her children moved her into a nursing home. He had nowhere else to go and no backup plan. When he came west, it felt as though he leapt across the continent and I caught him. And though my father could not abide being a burden, I often did feel burdened. His attempts to exert independence felt specifically designed to make my life harder. And nowhere was this battle more clearly drawn than over medical care. For more than half my childhood, until I was on my own after college and working in jobs that offered it, I was uninsured, as had been my mother, who had real need of it. She died just before age 60 after a series of strokes. She'd had high blood pressure for years, but wasn't on medication, in part because her job didn't offer health insurance. Even after this catastrophe, my father was unshaken in his doctrine. Western medicine is not to be trusted. It was one of his central tenets beginning when I was 10 years old, which happens to coincide with the time that he lost his job and we fell out of the middle class. When I was a child, the guardrails holding our family on track were vitamin C and pride. Why did our life become so chaotic and hard scrabble? My father had a hard time following rules. He had little impulse control and no filter, saying whatever flitted through his head, and he inevitably clashed with bosses and authority figures. He was tall, white, handsome, outgoing. He looked the part, the perfect patriarch. That opened doors, but the illusion quickly faded, and he was fired from almost every job he ever held. Those jobs included an administrator at a retirement home, twice, fired both times, an intergenerational community thought leader, a 7-Eleven night shift worker, a toll taker at the airport, a nonprofit founder with a tiny budget, no employees, and a remote boss. This was his most lasting gig. He did not do well with rule-bound administrative tasks or bureaucracy, and I can't imagine he was a good employee. He was relentlessly optimistic, but unpredictable in his reactions, prone to impractical ideas and bouts of frustrated anger that must have tried his coworkers' nerves. He was an enthusiast with unbounded, often unfounded confidence, a gold panner, the perfect mark for a flim-flam man. Once, a huckster roped him into a pyramid scheme selling some dubious product. Vitamins, timeshares, knife sets, I've blocked it out. To souls more trusting and hopeful than he. He couldn't find any. For decades, his medical advice came from a 1970s era vitamin book, tattered and stuffed with notes, another kind of Bible. In the vitamin aisle, he'd never stint. Though he spent thousands on supplements and organic produce over the years, it was still far cheaper than medical care. And for a time, it worked. I have no memory of either of my parents getting a checkup. I got sick, as kids do, and they took me to a strip mall emergency care clinic to treat ear infections or strep throat. I didn't suffer. They did not delay. And I remember feeling awkward there with strangers I'd never met and would likely not see again poking into my ears and mouth. Most of all, I was acutely aware that the bill was more than we could afford. I saw that in the way my mother pulled the checkbook from her purse, gripping the vinyl cover tightly. But it's important to say that in my earliest memories, my mother and I happily orbited around him. When he came home from work, he must have paused, changed clothes, kissed my mother, had a few moments of transition. But in my memory, every day, as soon as he walked in the door, I demanded his attention and got it. Up on the bed, I yelled at ages 2, 3, 4. And there would be me bouncing and leaping on my parents' enormous king-size mattress and my father catching me, raising me high, laughing as hard as I was. He was the son our household revolved around and the person I was happiest to see. And he seemed equally ecstatic to walk in the door and find me there waiting for him. My father was not one thing. And in the end, those same qualities that had caused so much upheaval allowed him to bluster his way to a chosen exit with nothing but force of will and confidence. That's not to say he didn't suffer. No one gets out unscathed. Thank you. Great to be here.